Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's online seminar hosted by the LSE International Inequalities Institute. My name is Alpa Shah. I'm Professor of Anthropology in the Department of Anthropology here and also the convener of the Global Economies of Care research theme at the International Inequalities Institute. I'm really delighted to be chairing today's seminar with Sara Farris, and I thank her for preparing a piece that reflects on the relationship between social reproduction and care. These two concepts are often used interchangeably and have, especially in recent years, come to the front of debates of those who wish to draw attention to the kind of gendered and racialized labor that often goes unnoticed, unmarked, unacknowledged. Yet are they the same? Does it matter? These are key questions that I think all of us, though seeking to understand gendered and racialized inequalities, have been, trying to get our heads around. So thank you so much, Sara, for coming and for sharing your thoughts and ideas. Sara comes to us from the Sociology department at Goldsmiths, the base from which she has produced brilliant work on social theory, gender, migration, care, and social reproduction. She's perhaps best known for her book In the Name of Women's Rights, The Rise of Femo-Nationalism, which explores the mobilization of feminist theories by nationalist parties with anti-immigration and anti-Islam campaigns. That's what she calls, femo-nationalism. She's worked on many other issues, not least social reproduction, care work, and migration. Our very own Naila Kabeer has very kindly come on board to discuss Sara's thoughts. Naila really needs no introduction to these series of events, but to those of you who don't know her, Naila Kabeer is Professor of Gender and Development at the Department of Gender Studies and Department of International Development here at the LSE. Naila has contributed very widely to debates in feminist economics, poverty, social exclusion, labor markets, livelihoods, social protection, citizenship. Naila, forgive me if I've missed a few key themes. She's always brings also the important lens of research focused on South and Southeast Asia to her wider ideas. I'm really delighted to put Naila and Sara in conversation. Thank you, Naila. So I'm first going to hand over to Sara to speak for about half an hour or so. Then I'll invite Naila for her comments, and before that, and then we'll open up the wider conversation. There'll be a chance for you all to pose questions to the speakers, and you can use the raise hand function or you can use the chat, and I'll probably invite you to speak anyway, even if you use chat. So do tell us your name and affiliation, but we'll go on to that in a bit. The next event at the Inequalities seminar series, which I've been asked to inform you about, is the prioritarianism in practice, with speakers Professor Matthew Adler and LSE III Director, Professor Francisco Ferreira. That's going to take place 12:30 to 1:30 next Tuesday, 24th of May. And the link to that event, along with more upcoming events, can be found in our chat. So without any further ado, Sara, over to you. Many thanks to all and enjoy the event.
Thanks a lot, Alpa. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thanks to the International Inequalities Institute, to you for organizing, Shalini, Naila for joining the conversation. It's a pleasure, really, and an honor for me. I learned a lot from Naila's work. So today I really want to present what are somehow still in progress thoughts on care and social reproduction, trying really to understand what are the differences. We know the similarities, I guess, in many ways, but really what are the differences? Are there differences? And as you, Alpa, said, does it matter to acknowledge these differences? I'm going to read my paper also to keep within really the allocated to the time that I have. So the late David Graeber, writing a few months into the COVID-19 crisis in 2020, invited us to consider not the pandemic, but neoliberalism as a dream or a nightmare to awake from, when he was actually saying, in a few months, they will tell us this is just a dream and we will wake from this. But he said, well, it's more neoliberalism, the nightmare from which we need to be awake. the exposure of the essentiality of care, of our very dependency on care brought about by the pandemic, he maintained, was actually our wake-up call. In particular, it imposed on us to ask two questions. Why are those activities that sustain our life so undervalued? What kind of society is one in which the practices that are most important to most of us, for instance, the nursery teacher who makes sure our children do not get hurt, the caregiver who keeps our elderly parents alive, or the cleaner who makes sure our offices or houses are clean and enjoyable? So why are all these essential activities the ones which are socially considered and paid the least? Both the frameworks known as social reproduction feminism and the ethics and politics of care have addressed these questions for a long time. In the last 10 years or so, discussions on care and social reproduction have intensified, and partly I believe this is also, not exclusively, but also because a new generation of feminists is now interrogating and reinterpreting the new phases of the gender division of labor. These concepts are more often than not used as synonyms. You might very often read care and social reproduction as synonyms, or at least they are used as terms that look at different dimensions of what Titi Bhattacharya calls the whole of life-making activities. In my own work on care and domestic migrant workers, particularly in the European context, I have also used these concepts in tandem to refer to the type of labor which is undertaken mostly by racialized women, particularly in Europe. Now, this paper is not an endeavor at creating some kind of antagonism between these two perspectives, but rather an attempt at perhaps in some form integrating what I regard as the most important aspects of these two approaches in order to build a truly transformative feminism. May I say an anti-capitalist feminism, although of course I am well aware that we don't do that just in the space of a seminar or in this context. Now, in what follows, I will provide a very brief overview of both perspectives and then highlight what I consider their important differences as well as their strategic contributions. Let me begin from social reproduction feminism. This is not a homogeneous paradigm, but most scholars who belong to this theoretical tradition tend to quote and agree with Barbara Laslett and Joanna Brenner's expansive definition of social reproduction, according to which social reproduction refers to all those activities and attitudes, behaviors and emotions, responsibilities and relationships directly involved in the maintenance of life on a daily basis and intergenerationally. Among other things, social reproduction includes how food, clothing, and shelter are made available for immediate consumption, the ways in which the care and socialization of children are provided, the care of the infirm and elderly, and the social organization of sexuality. Social reproduction can thus be seen to include various kinds of work, mental, manual, and emotional, aimed at providing the historically and socially, as well as biologically defined care necessary to maintain its existing life and to reproduce the next generation. And the organization of social reproduction refers to the varying institutions within which this work is performed, the varying strategies for accomplishing these tasks, and the varying ideologies that both shaped and are shaped by them. End of the quote. Now, this is a long quote, but I think it's important also in order to see later on some of the striking similarities with definitions of care within the politics of care framework in particular. Now, the key points advanced by social reproduction theorists are that all the activities involved in the reproduction and maintenance of life are labor. And crucially, this is labor that stands in a necessary, albeit contradictory relationship with capitalist production. For social reproduction feminists, such a contradictory relationship is also one of the root causes of women's oppression under capitalism, both in the global north, where the creation of the nuclear heterosexual family led to the devalorization of reproductive activities undertaken mostly by women, as well as to the primacy of the space of production, but also in the global south, where, for instance, the growing participation of women in the paid workforce is not matched by public spending on care, nor by changes in the domestic division of labor, thereby leading to what many scholars, including Naila, call a crisis of care that is taking place in parts of the global south. So in the words of Titi Bhattacharya, the fundamental insight of social reproduction theory is that human labor is at the heart of creating or reproducing society as a whole. The notion of labor is conceived here in the original sense in which Karl Marx meant it, as the first premise of all human history. On that, ironically, and this is one of the criticisms that social reproduction theories have to Marx, ironically, Marx himself failed to develop fully his understanding of labor in this sense. So capitalism, however, for Bhattacharya, acknowledges productive labor for the market as the sole form of legitimate work, while the tremendous amount of familial as well as communitarian work that goes on to sustain and reproduce the worker, or more specifically, her labor power, is naturalized into non-existence. Against this, social reproduction theorists perceive the relation between labor dispensed to produce commodities and labor dispensed to produce people as part of the systemic totality of capitalism. The framework thus seeks to make visible labor and work that are analytically hidden by classical economists and politically denied by policymakers. For social reproduction feminism, the focus is squarely on labor in two respects. Social reproduction involves care labor that serve to reproduce individuals and societies, but it is also labor that reproduces labor power. That is the most precious commodity that allows capital to be valorized and accumulated. Hence, social reproduction's necessary, although contradictory relationship to capitalism. In the transition to capitalism, social reproductive activities within households that used to sustain families are no longer considered productive or properly work, but degraded to the status of unproductive, naturalized as vocationally feminine activities, as well as reserved for racialized populations. The fundamental stigmatization and devaluation of these activities, which is concomitantly classed, gendered, and racialized, is at the core of the low status of social reproduction, even in paid form. Care professions, from the domestic worker to the caregiver, the babysitter, the teacher, and the cleaner, and so forth, are some of the categories, if not the categories, worst remunerated in our societies, which is a situation that the pandemic has brought under plain light. Now, let me move to a brief overview of the ethics and politics of care. Here, the framework that has come to be known as the ethics of care has its roots in the work of developmental psychologist Carol Gilligan, who in the 1980s studied the difference in moral attitudes between boys and girls. The ethics of care, indeed, as in the work of moral philosopher Virginia Held, departs from an understanding of care as a fundamentally gendered attitude and maintains that care, as a moral value, is opposed to the dominant liberal ethics based on the individual as independent and autonomous. The ethics of care, in fact, acknowledges that individuals are interdependent. In her words, in the words of Virginia Held, to the ethics of care, persons are not just imagined to be relational and interdependent. This is the way they are seen to actually be. They start out in need of vast amounts of actual caring labor and continue to need it at various times. Some persons need it continuously. The ethics of care appreciates that care is not only an empirical necessity. Moral values are embedded in practices of care. End of the quote. On these premises, Held maintains that an ethics of care would offer better moral grounds to organize and caring societies for which the needs of individuals would be put first. Care thus is the very foundation, we can say, or truth of human societies, because everyone needs care at important junctures of their lives. Now, departing from somewhat similar premises, political theorist John Tronto in the 1990s introduced the politics of care as both an attempt to establish care as a political category in its own right, and to identify the normative enunciations that would derive from such an acknowledgement. She thus analyzed how the depoliticization of care historically, in the Western canon at least, was due to centuries of political framing of caring activities as bound to nature, parochial, and unable to understand the compromise and evil as part of politics. In one of the earliest formulations, Tronto and Fisher thus defined care as a species activity that includes everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. Care allows us to reconceive equality, according to Tronto still, in such terms of mutual interdependence. Care is both universal and particularistic. Care is universal because all humans need care at some point in their lives. At the very least, people need care as infants, when they are infirm, and often when they are dying. Care is particularistic because answers to such questions as what kinds of care, how much, who is providing it, are deeply tied not only to culture, but to gendered, classed, raced, and other structural features of any culture. So for the ethics of care, so for the ethics and politics of care, care is an attitude, it is a relationship, and it is a practice, which is both universal, as we've just seen in the quote from John Tronto, because it forms, according to her, our experience as species beings, but is also particularistic because different societies organize and may conceive of care differently. Care is labor for the ethics and politics of care, but it's not only labor. For the ethics and politics of care, care is what we do when we act through our human interconnectedness and vulnerability, especially when such actions are informed by values of attentiveness, solidarity, and trust. This type of care, thus, is the normative organizing principle that could transform our societies into more equal and enjoyable places to live in. Now, as I noted at the outset of this paper, the majority of scholars who work in these fields tend to use the two terms either as synonyms or as concepts that refer to different aspects of the process of life-making. However, I believe that in more recent years, as discussions on care and social reproduction have come more and more to the center of our feminist debates, scholars have also begun to draw clearer boundaries between the two. So for example, Emma Dowling, in a recent book published a couple of years ago called The Crisis of Care, she writes that while care is a social relation that manifests itself in thoughts, words, gestures, as well as priorities and commitments, in contrast, social reproduction is a functional economic category used to describe the institutionalized separation between productive and reproducing activities and the arrangements within capitalist economies. For Dowling, care is not reducible to the labor of social reproduction. Using the term care invokes the relational and affective, but also the ethical dimensions of looking after ourselves and others. So essentially, care is about the maintenance of life for itself. Care is therefore more than the necessary labor of reproducing a healthy workforce. The concern with care is the reminder that reproductivist arguments for investing in care are not sufficient to capture what is at stake, namely the possibility of leading a meaningful life beyond merely instruments of labor. So this is the position of Emma Dowling, who in many respects, I would say, I think she places her work both within the framework of social reproduction. On the other hand, the Virginia Held, who is, I think, one of the major proponents of the ethics of care, she's a moral philosopher, a feminist moral philosopher. She writes, if one accepts a Marxist distinction between productive and reproductive labor, and then sees caring as reproductive labor, as some propose, one misses the way caring, especially for children, can be transformative rather than merely reproductive and repetitious. On the other hand, for feminist geographer Eleanor Kaufman, engaging with the concept of social reproduction enables us to place care work within a wider landscape of activities and sites, and to connect supposedly disparate circuits of migration, in particular labor, family, and education, which are usually analyzed separately, but which are in fact interconnected. These diverse circuits all contribute to different configurations of social reproduction, which may be initiated by different migratory flows. Now, what Eleanor Kaufman did, she's a well-known migration scholar, is quite interesting because in the field of migration studies, especially gender migration, the concept which is used the most is really the concept of care labor, care chains, etc. And what Kaufman is proposing is that through the concept of social reproduction, instead, we could connect a number of fields that are usually treated separately. So she's trying to propose, if we want, conceptual shift. Now here I'm quoting only some of the scholars who, at least to my knowledge, have explicitly engaged in a discussion on the differences between care and social reproduction as conceptual domains. These discussions clearly identify labor as the key differentiating term, where social reproduction is seen as considering care mainly as care work, while care theorists see care as exceeding work to include the affective dimensions that inform the practices of caring. Now, undoubtedly, this is a key difference between the two approaches, which is also due in many ways, I think, to the disciplinary and political differences between some of those who are engaged in these debates. For instance, feminist economists have tended to use more the concept of social reproduction. And I believe also because social reproduction has this focus on care as labor, as work, while moral philosophers such as Virginia Held have more of a focus on care. But I think there are also political considerations and differences here at play, which we might discuss later. But now I think that the differences between these two approaches go beyond the focus on care as labor or care as affect, value, etc. So in the next and final part of the paper, I want to focus on what I think are further differences. Now, firstly, the ethics and politics of care conceives of care as that activity or practice that brings together individuals through positive affect. So these theorists tend to focus on what is valuable in our relationships, which can be friendship, which can be our love relationships, caring relationships, and usually really I would say the quintessential example which is used to express the care relationship is the one of a mother to her child. So Virginia Held, for instance, makes very clear that the attitude that one has towards care is crucial for the quality of the caring relationship. A caregiver, for instance, she says, who provides care, paid care to a child or an elderly person, but without feeling an emotional bond to them, according to her, cannot be a good carer. So the attitude is important. Social reproduction feminism, on the other hand, underscores care labor in its various incarnations as double-faced. The affects involved in the context of care and domestic labor performed at home in paid form, but also in unpaid form, can assume very different meanings for the employee and the employer, for instance, or for the husband and the wife in a situation of, for instance, unequal division of labor. So for the former, for the employee or for the wife, feelings such as love for the children she's looking after, or affection for the elderly person that she's caring for, or sympathy for a good employer they might be lucky to have, can go hand in hand with disgust, unhappiness, and a sense of servility. So with affects that are not positive, with actually negative feelings. And this reminds us, as Gutierrez Rodriguez puts it, that affects are not free-floating energies. The expression and transmission of affects occur in a space which is marked by historically produced, socially configured, and culturally located power relations. These are the words of sociologist Gutierrez Rodriguez. So for social reproduction theorists, the affects involved in care are not necessarily those of love and nurture, because the conditions in which care labor takes place are often conditions of exploitation, oppression, and frustration. In the words of Silvia Federici, in capitalist society, reproductive work is not the free reproduction of ourselves or others according to our and their desires. To the extent that directly or indirectly it is exchanged for a wage, reproduction work is at all points subjected to the conditions imposed on it by the capitalist organization and relations of production. Secondly, social reproduction theory recognizes the ambivalence of reproductive care labor as also its potential, as this is labor that stands in an unstable relationship with capitalist production, because it's midway between the market and extra-market economy. It is potentially subversive. In other words, we can think of reorganizing care in such a way that it is entirely outside market relations, as labor which is undertaken entirely for the regeneration of human necessary labor, rather than for the reproduction of exploited labor power. In this sense, I would argue that while social reproduction takes into account the ethical dimensions of care as those subversive aspects of caring that can disrupt the capitalist logic, much of the framework of care does not take enough into account the socially reproductive aspect of care deriving from capitalism, or care as also alienated as well as racialized and exploitative labor. The recognition of care not only as a social relation informed by ethical considerations, as in Virginia's health sense, but as a social relation informed by power dynamics that go beyond the best intentions of individuals involved. And here I use the concept of social relation in Marxist sense, I think also helps us to understand that care can be a battlefield in which interdependence, which is the key term for the ethics of care theorists, takes very often the form of antagonism. So this latter aspect for me is crucial, both in the form of unpaid care provided by women for free within households, and in the form of commodified care provided very often by racialized working class women for a very low pay. The space in which the caregiver and the care receiver encounter each other is organized by patriarchal and capitalist social relations. And in this sense, it is a battlefield. Moreover, the relation of production in which our lives are enmeshed have an inevitable impact on our social reproduction, and therefore on the time and money that we have available for the caring activities that we value the most. Essentially, and I'm really going to my conclusions, I believe that care within much ethics and politics of care operates as a moral compass, or if you want, a horizon that departs from, in some ways, an idealization of care as a loving relationship, which, as I said, takes this mother-child model as the quintessential example and projects it onto a desirable future. So rather than an ontology of relationality, as it's been described, that seeks to tell us how care operates in the present at large, I think the ethics of care and politics of care operates more as a normative and utopian framework, if you want, on how things could be and should be. On the other hand, social reproduction feminists provide a picture of care as a set of activities necessarily linked to the sphere of production and inevitably shaped by capitalism. So social reproduction tries to provide an explanation of why things are the way they are. But on the other hand, I think social reproduction theory tells us less, or tries less to tell us how things could be and should be. It has less these, if you like, utopian horizon. So my point is that we need both. We need powerful explanatory frameworks, but we also need the vision of an alternative possible future. Thank you very much for listening to this long presentation.
Wow, that's such a generous way of actually, bringing together what are in fact, two quite diverse and potentially competitive strands of thinking about care and social reproduction. So I really admire you for that. Thank you so much. But before we turn to questions, and let me hand over to Naila. Naila Kabeer, please, to share your thoughts. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Let me echo Alpa to say that it wasn't just generous, but it was also a very ambitious and a very thought-provoking presentation. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to read the paper, so it's trying to take in what you're saying and trying to kind of digest it rapidly enough to say something intelligent in response. I think, first of all, I really welcome making that distinction between care and reproduction, because I think for those of us in the Global South who look at women's work, I often feel a little bit overshadowed by the focus on care, which is as it has evolved, I think, in the North, among Northern feminists. It's become the big concept. Whereas I think in the Global South, especially women in rural areas, etc., engage in a lot of activities that are not counted as economic, they're not sold, but neither are they counted as care. But they are like gathering fuel, water, homestead cultivation, all of these things are for the consumption, the immediate or delayed consumption of the family, but find themselves very uneasily positioned between the production and the care economy. So I think that has been very important. I think the second thing I took away from what you were saying is really what it is that is distinctive about what we call care. And, the idea of the relational, I think, is distinctive, right? There are things that can be outsourced to other people without needing them to care about you. There are many sorts of activities. I think the care subset are about those activities where the nurturing element, the caring element, the importance of interpersonal relationships and interdependence, the doing of something almost for its own sake, rather than necessarily, other kind of instrumental rationales. I think that's, if you like, kind of a core element of care. And that is hard to measure. And you can talk about skills in reproductive work, but it's quite hard to define skills in caring work because of that affective dimension, which means a lot of very good care goes unrewarded and unnoticed because you don't distinguish it from very bad care. It also brings to me the question of the voluntary and the involuntary, the enforced and the chosen. And here I think it's not just about capitalism. I think many systems of production, many modes of production, whichever mode of production has a rigid gender division of labor, which ascribes responsibility for the caring functions to one group and frees the other group to get on with other things, immediately becomes oppressive, because the element of choice is gone, the element of voluntariness is gone. And that's why I think this argument about abortion that's going on at the moment is so critical, because part of it is about voluntary caring of children, having the children that you want in order that you can care and love them. And to force people to have children that they are not ready for, don't want, is a politically very harmful thing for the future citizens, you know, children brought up without love. I also thought about, you know, there's a kind of a gift element to voluntary care. You don't do it, it's not transactional. You do it for the love of it, you do it for the intrinsic value of it, and you do it with the hope of it being returned in some way. But it doesn't have any of the hallmarks of transactions. And so it takes me back to the question that I think puzzles us all. How did we get to a situation where this activity, unless it's done for pay, does not count? You know, how do we get to a situation where policies are not developed to support the people who are doing these activities on an unpaid basis? And it really takes us back to the illogic of the original measurement issues and the measurement thinking. And so I think what you're talking about, the ethics, I think the politics of care has been really important, a reminder that not all care is voluntary. It's very interesting, the National Sample Survey of India each year finds successively larger numbers of women saying they do unpaid work out of necessity. And by that, I don't think they mean unpaid care work. I don't think so. I think they're talking about all the other stuff they have to do. So it really does take me back to thinking about how do we shift away from economies that are based on profits and growth, and that's what you are talking about, the ethics, to what people are calling an economy of well-being. You know, how do we take the ethics of care and locate it, if you like, the micro and the macro level, as a part of our thinking about what an economy of well-being might look like. I think that's all my thoughts on this, really. So I'll give it back to Alpa.
Thanks so much, Naila. Sara, would you like to respond to Naila and Naila's reflections immediately before I open the floor up?
Yeah, maybe just quickly. I mean, I agree with everything that Naila said. I mean, yeah, I would respond to one thing which really stays with me because, I mean, there are so many things to say really about all the aspects you touched on, Naila, but really the last thing, how did we get to a situation in which these non-transactional dimension of care, which is the one that we value when we love somebody, we don't do it because we expect it in return, we just do it out of solidarity and love, in fact. So how did we get into a situation in which that is not what we do or is not valued? And this is really such a key question. And I think that is precisely why a reflection on the social relations of production as essential to understand the organization of care, it's so important. And because I think here we need a fundamental reflection on time. Most of us do not have the time to value those relationships. Most, particularly working class racialized populations, do not have the time because they are working, they are doing exploitative work most of the time. And even when, as you said, women do some of this work, which is not even recognized as care for free, they still very often don't feel of it as rewarding or as non-transactional pure love, because there are so many other constraints that somehow inhibit or, how can I say, spoil that experience. It becomes frustration, it becomes of course, it's not transactional, but also you would like to have more time for care for yourself, for example. So I would say that that's why I believe that the ethics of care is very important. And it's important precisely because of this reminder of what care as the love and non-transactional relationship can be, but in failing, in my view, to take into account really what capitalism does to our relationship. And in failing to understand, in my view, that interdependence is antagonism very often, in a way, does not, how can I say, really it becomes this utopian vision in some ways, which we need. I think social reproduction, on the other hand, doesn't do enough of that. But at the same time, I think we absolutely need the framework of capitalism to understand not only how care is and why it's like that, and is devalued, etc., like that, but also how it could be. But I also agree with you, maybe one last thing that I will say very quickly. I also agree with you when you said it's not just capitalism. And I agree also in another sense, because I think that within the social reproductive framework, there is obviously much of a focus on capitalism as having this essential relationship with social reproduction, the sphere of production and reproduction. But I think we also need a reflection on the state, because, and I say this also for the politics of care, because we can see, we should see, for example, this is something I would like to study more in the future, how societies in which care has been, for instance, in the GDR or in the post-socialist countries, when societies were not organized capitalistically, strictly speaking, care was still not organized very fairly. In some ways, was organized more fairly. There were more care arrangements for women, but still women were not more equal. So I think we need to take into account these elements. The state is absolutely crucial. And in some politics of care, I don't see much of a critical reflection on the state. I see very much the idea that we should have caring states as in welfare states. And of course, I agree, it would be much better than what we have now, but still without forgetting that even those states are organized in such ways and still have a certain interest in the control of women's bodies as nation states.
Thanks so much, Sara. I'm going to invite questions from the floor. I had one of my own, if I'm allowed to pose to you, but oh yeah, I see there's a number of hands up already. Maybe I will hand over to other people first. Doris Murphy, would you like to just unmute yourself and welcome on board? Just if you could introduce briefly who you are and then your question.
Yeah, I'm Doris Murphy. I'm doing my PhD in University College Cork in Ireland, and I'm looking at care and sex work with Prof. Maggie O'Neill and Dr. Chiara Bonfiglioli as my supervisors. So I loved the whole discussion. Thank you, Sara. And I arrived a little bit late because I couldn't find my link. So I was wondering, had you mentioned Kathleen Lynch, who is a wonderful Irish sociologist who has literally, I went running to get my book, just released this book, Care and Capitalism, and where she really, again, discusses these issues about the state and again, making your point or echoing your point that it's not just capitalism, you know, capitalism is a huge issue, but also maybe, yeah, so I was just wondering, have you looked into Kathleen Lynch's work and do you have any kind of comments on it? Thank you.
Sara?
Do you want me to respond? Okay.
Just briefly, and then I'll turn to Shradha Jane and maybe
I mean, the answer here is brief because no, Doris, I have not, I don't know this, but it looks so relevant and interesting that I am like going to order it now.
Thanks. Shradha Jane.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, thank you so much for giving this opportunity to hear this fascinating lecture. I'm doing my PhD on intra-household negotiations over child care, and I have also been involved in doing some research on paid domestic work. So it was very illuminating to hear all these discussions. So I have a few observations. I just want you to reflect on them. I'm sorry if I am not very clear in putting across what is there in mind. Firstly, if we start with the Marxian separation of productive and reproductive work, so where would you place the paid care segment? Will it become a productive in the older sense of productive economized work now because it's paid? So how paid care, reproductive or productive? Secondly, I'm currently reading some stuff on social security and social protection. So it came to my mind, if we consider social reproduction as reproduction of future labor, then it also means social security should also come under social reproduction framework. That for workers, it's also required to maintain them and provide a cushioning from contingency. Thirdly, as Professor Naila Kabeer mentioned, in many South Asian countries, there's a continuum of paid, unpaid, formal, informal. So we can't really separate out these activities. So here, what is reproductive and what is care? If I think in terms of putting it to operationalizing this in an empirical study, that would be very interesting to discuss. Bringing these two together. So I've been reading some stuff on social care. So social care vis-a-vis social reproduction, some thoughts on that. Lastly, your comment on care being thought more as a utopian idea. I'm not very sure about this because the current literature on paid domestic work tells us there is a lot of thought over how paid domestic work is underpaid, while some employers want to evoke this family relation concept. So, so these were some random thoughts. I'll be happy if you can respond to.
Thank you so much, Shradha. These are really, really smart questions and really, really thoughtful comments. I'm just going to hand over to Chico first before I come back to you, Sara. I actually want to pick up on a couple of things Shradha said too. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sara. That was really interesting. I feel I'm quite ignorant of this literature and topic, so forgive me if these are very sort of basic questions, but I had two questions. One, you obviously, your talk's fundamentally about the distinction between these two literatures, care and social reproduction, or concepts. And in your discussion, it seemed to me that they were mostly differences of perspective, looking at the same set of activities performed by people. So one was more about the labor aspect, the other was, required what you called affect, and maybe some more normative issues, some emotional characteristics even. Now, when Naila spoke in commenting on your talk, she raised a distinction that was a distinction about the kinds of activities. So there might possibly be some activities, and I think she mentioned some around farming, subsistence farming, or before she spoke, I was thinking in my mind of home repairs, unpaid home repairs, which, probably unpaid home repairs, in my mind, is social reproduction, but perhaps it's not care directly, but maybe I'm thinking of care too narrowly. So the question is are there two different distinctions, one of perspective and one of actually of the set of characteristics, which clearly overlap, but may not be, they intersect, but may not be exactly the same set of activities? That's question one. And I guess related to that question, one that one of the speakers just before me also mentioned, how does the paid versus unpaid come in here? Which I think for economists, and I'm not surprised Naila mentioned it, something we worry a lot about because we count one kind and not the other. And that's clearly problematic. But is that also part of the distinction between social reproduction and care? Thank you.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you, Chico, for actually very important comments, and I mean, for me too, just if I can pitch in here, I mean, to me, the crucial thing about social reproduction theory is the unpaid labor, right? Which can take so many different forms, including getting fuel for firewood, including, which Naila mentioned, including subsistence farming, which, Chico mentioned, which hasn't been counted. And the crucial issue in this is the fact that, this isn't recognized in capital accumulation, which then looks only at, paid labor or production, right? Labor in productive processes. So so that to me seems like a really important theoretical and political intervention of social reproduction theory, right? And so I was really kind of struck by what you said about how social reproduction theory doesn't provide us, it provides us with an explanation of why things are the way they are. It tells us less about how things should be. But to me, the whole point was that this whole emerged from the campaigns for things like wages for housework, and that we need to count this unpaid labor, right? And which also then relates to what Shradha said about social protection, because in a way, the basic income campaigns, some of the social protection campaigns are taking exactly this issue forward in the present day, right? That if we all had a basic income, then all of those things which are, we wouldn't, we are like a decent basic income, then we wouldn't have to have all of these divides between paid and unpaid labor, and we'd solve the problem, and, we'd all be able to be creative and then create those utopian communities of care that the ethics of care are proposing. So anyway, so I think that there's a whole load there in what Chico highlighted, but also in what Shradha said, and how care work, like the kind of care work that Shalini works on, is actually productive labor, because that is waged work, So I think there are these conceptual issues that need to be delineated, and I think you cannot address that without thinking about the political implications of what we're arguing and what we're arguing for as a result of having these different categories. So you had a very little brief thing on politics, but I think that actually has to be central, and I'd like to know much more about what your thinking on that is. And I don't know if you'd like to comment, Sara, but I could invite one more person, Pratap Chandra Behera, who has his hand up, to ask his question, and then maybe you can address us all together as we close. And also we can turn to Naila if she has any last minute reflections. Pratap Chandra Behera.
Okay, so good evening, may I? Okay. Am I audible? I'm Pratap from, I teach social work in University of Delhi. So care as a concept is so dear to us. Still, I'm not so clear about the concepts that is discussed here. So, some sort of, clarification would educate me definitely. So that is one part. So I am trying to tell that, but the impression that I am getting is that from the overall discussion is that care, the way I try to understand, quote unquote, has already become commodified. So there is business, so there is politics. So my struggle is that it did not happen automatically, I believe. It has emerged, it has become an outcome, and one is that perhaps because the care that used to be in our traditional institutions, that is declining, or there are some other societal features that declined, and that's why the market forces are taking that place, or if the market knowingly damaged those institutions. I don't know. So that is one struggle that is happening, or there are other reasons why this is emerging as a market. Is it just because there is wealth, there is capitalist forces? That's why the care as a business emerged. I mean, the process of capital was there 100 years before. maybe 200 years before. But as a business, it did not emerge. But right now in this current stage, it has emerged. So the wealth was there. Care was not a business. Now the wealth is here. Now care has become a business. So that is somehow, and some of it is happening. We see that. So, and then the next struggle is that care and the social reproduction. More so the care. I see it's a very generic term, and care means so many things. If we list it out, it can be 10, 20, or 100. So then, what of care is getting commodified? I don't think all of care would be commodified at all, but then some of the components are mostly commodified. So what are these? Is there such categorization or segregation? So what of care or what's of care are getting commodified more and more, not the other aspects of care. So then that also,
Thank you, sorry, I would like to hand over back to Sara to have a few words of reflection, because we've only got 4 minutes left, so it would be great to hand over to her to answer some of these rich questions that have been asked. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you really so much, because there are so many questions and I'm not sure I will be able to, do justice to all the comments and questions you asked me. And I should also say, really thank you so much for this discussion, because as I said at the beginning, this is really still a work in progress. I am working on these distinctions. I personally locate my work within the framework of social reproduction, although in many ways, I am one of those who, as I said, has used the care and social reproduction very often interchangeably as a migration scholar and as one who works in the field of care and gender, because these are the terms that are used in the debate. But I find myself to work mostly in the social reproduction feminism framework. So maybe the first thing I would say, I think this was raised by Alpa and also by Shradha, is that when I say that the social reproduction framework tries less to produce a utopian or to give us this utopian vision of the future, what I mean is not so much that social reproduction feminism does not propose alternatives or ways to thinking about solutions to the exploitative and oppressive nature of social reproduction. Of course, there are, not only the wages for housework. Thanks so much to, I can't remember who, it was Alpa perhaps who mentioned that, I don't remember. But there are also many proposals to really provide, to build social reproduction and care in alternative ways. So what I think though at the same time is that the framework of social reproduction, understandably, and I think in many ways right enough, has really tried to provide us with a very powerful explanatory framework of why social reproduction and care are organized in such a way in our societies, why so many women have done it for free, why it's been undervalued and continues to be undervalued in our societies, even when it is paid. And so obviously linking it up to the transition from feudalism to capitalism, to the very ways in which gender oppression functions under capitalism and so on and so forth. And in that sense, I think that perhaps more in our, if you like, we spend so much of our energy in these explanatory endeavors that sometimes I feel we should do more, and I put myself in the group. We should do more really to think about these futures, also taking into account the state. I personally think, yes, we definitely need to get rid of our exploitative relationships of capitalist social relations, but the state is a crucial, in my view, how can we say, relation, because I think that is also a relation that needs to be thought through. And in that sense, I think this is really an invitation to myself first and to the social reproduction theorists, perhaps, to make an effort more in this direction. And the second thing, perhaps, I would say, also trying to respond to Francisco and in response to Naila, my understanding also of Naila's point was that some of the activities that are social reproduction in the global south, they were not even considered as care. And I think that's true, but it is because in many ways, that's also my understanding of Naila's comment, so much the theories of care and our understanding of care has been very much informed by a reflection on what happens in the global north, so much that the work that can be care and social reproduction in the global south is not recognized as such. So there is a sense, in a way, I think, a certain inflation, and so much of the ethics of care and politics of care in many ways really departs from these Western considerations and concept. The whole politics of care is a reflection on the depoliticization of care in the Western political canon. So I think that reflects in the ways in which certain activities were not recognized or considered as care. The commodification of care, this is a very important point and is one of the areas of my work. Definitely the commodification, marketization, corporatization of care have been huge processes in the last 20 years. They have been driven by many factors. I know more about what these factors are in Europe. So sorry if my comments probably reflect more that, but certainly what's been going on in Europe in the last 20 years is that with the aging of the elderly population, with the participation of more and more women in the labor market, with the cuts to the welfare state due to neoliberalism, a large proportion of care, such as elderly care and child care and healthcare, of course, are increasingly commodified, meaning that both they are undergoing a market relationship. We pay for these services of care, but they are, I am sorry, somebody.
Also, it's also a call to say that we've run out of time, Sara. So maybe it's a good moment.
I'm sorry, I can go forever on the commodification of care, but these are the sectors. So thanks, and sorry for being long.
No, thank you so much, Sara, for a very stimulating, thought-provoking, and actually very important paper. We hope that you will develop it for publication soon, and that some of the thoughts in the seminar will help towards that. And thank you all for coming, for contributing with such lively debates, and also coming from completely different parts of the III who have, not been engaging in these debates and posing your questions, and from India and everywhere where we've got people from all over the world here. So thank you all, and thank you, Sara, thank you, Naila, thank you to the III team as well. All bye.
Thank you very much to you all.